Good evening. Welcome to the June 12th Governance and Priorities Committee meeting. I'd like to first recognize that we're on the traditional territory of the Snuneymuxw First Nation. Our clerk tonight is Ms. Gurry. We also have the following councillors attending electronically. Actually, we don't have anybody attending electronically. Good to see everybody in the flesh. Tonight's Governance and Priorities Committee meeting will be held in accordance with the Community Charter and Council Procedure Bylaw 2018-7272. If during the meeting any member of the gallery has a question regarding an agenda item, please write down your name and the agenda item on the question period sign-up sheet, which is on the table by the double doors to my left. Please note that the Council Procedure Bylaw has been updated and questions may be asked related to reports. Before we start the meeting, I'd like to take a few minutes to remind those who are attending in person about the rules of decorum for all council and committee meetings. A meeting of council is intended to be a place where democracy can freely take place in a respectful and safe manner. The council chambers is a workplace, and there are considerations council and staff must make to ensure that a safe work environment exists in accordance with WorkSafe BC regulations. To support this, disrespectful conduct will not be tolerated, so we ask that there will be no cheering, jeering, or other outbursts from the gallery at any time. This will ensure that everyone speaking, whether it be a delegation, member of council, or staff, is not interrupted and can make their point freely without distraction or fear of ridicule. In the instance where a speaker is being inappropriate or has exceeded their time limit, their microphone will be cut off. Similarly, if there are any outbursts by any person in the gallery, they'll be asked to stop, and if they do not comply, they may be asked to leave as permitted under Section 133 of the Community Charter. If necessary, council may call a recess in order to reset the environment of the council chambers. It is our belief that if everyone is respectful in these basic considerations, this meeting and future meetings will be effective in furthering the business of the City of Nanaimo. The first item on the agenda is the introduction of late items. Ms. Gurry, do we have any late items?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So not listed on your annotated, there is the late item, and it's the report and recommendations and findings by Lisa Sworn. They were an addendum item added on Monday. And that's it, Chair.
Thank you. Could we have a motion for the adoption of the agenda as amended? Moved by Councillor Perino, seconded by Councillor Thorpe. All in favor? Motion carried. And a motion for the adoption of minutes as circulated. Moved by Director Eastmere, seconded by Director Armstrong. All in favor? Motion carried. This brings us to agenda planning, upcoming topics and initiatives to be introduced by Ms. Gurry, Director of Legislative Services.
Thanks, Chair, and good evening again. So this upcoming topics and initiatives is in your agenda, and listed is tonight's meeting. Actually, not listed as tonight's meeting, listed as the next meeting, which is to take place on June 24th, our regularly scheduled Governance and Priorities Committee meeting. And the topic at that meeting will be the Public Works Yard and discussion regarding options for funding. So this was a council request, and that is coming to the next GPC meeting. At that meeting, Chair, we are hoping to discuss the future GPC topics, dates to be determined still as of yet. We have some tentative dates, and looking at tentative GPC topics, dates to be determined as well, and getting any other upcoming topics and initiatives that you would like to speak about as committee members, and so looking at that possibly at our next meeting on June 24th, unless there's anything you'd like to discuss this evening.
Any comments by council at this time? I'm not seeing any. Move on to the next item. Thank you, Ms. Gurry. Reports. Under Empowered Nanaimo, we have Lisa Sworn, Alternative Approval Process Review, and that'll be introduced by our CAO, Mr. Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good evening, Council. I believe we have Ms. Warren with us. I'll just give her a second to join. Great. Good evening, Ms. Warren. I'm just doing a brief introduction. I'll turn it over to you. Through the chair, Council, or certainly the committee will certainly be aware that earlier this year we had the second of two failed or canceled AAP processes that were both related to the Public Works, proposed building at Public Works. Following those canceled processes, I felt it was important that we conduct a third-party peer review. I thought not only do we owe it to council, but also to the community to make sure that we better understand going forward where mistakes were made and in the future, so we can have the confidence of council and the community to conduct any future AAPs that are necessary. So Ms. Sworn, who is, in addition to being a lawyer, has past history of being a corporate officer, is a professional registered parliamentarian, and is currently an instructor of public administration, and has worked for, I would say, decades in the province of BC, and is well known and well respected. So I reached out to her directly, and I'm very pleased that she was agreeable to take on this task. So you have before you tonight her report, which I would say is both a bit of a post-mortem on our canceled AAP processes, but most importantly, maybe recommendations for moving forward. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Ms. Warren to walk through her report, and I'm sure she'll be happy to answer any questions that you have this evening.
Thank you very much. Through the chair, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the traditional territory of the Kwantlen, Katzie, and Semiahmoo First Nations, and I wish to pay my respect to these peoples. What I'd like to do tonight is provide you with a summary of the report that I have submitted for your consideration. Now, the scope of the work was to review the alternative approval processes that involve the borrowing bylaw for the Nanaimo Operations Center. In particular, I'll use the short form AAP number 1, which took place between May through to November of 2023, and AAP number 2, which took place from December 23rd to January 2024. The purpose of this review was to determine what challenges occurred in each of those AAPs in order to make recommendations on how to try to address those challenges in the future. This is based on my experience as a corporate officer and as an instructor in the corporate administration. I want to make it very clear that I'm not providing legal advice to the city, nor am I commenting on the legal advice received by the city during the course of those two AAPs. I'm just commenting on staff's conduct based on the legal advice received by them. So, in terms of methodology, I conducted a number of reviews with staff and an elected official. I've reviewed ministerial guidelines on how to administer both the public notice bylaw and the AAP, documents which have been created by staff, documents which have been reviewed by the city, or received by the city, various newspaper articles, as well as watching the council meetings where the various matters were discussed. Just to give a bit of clarity, I won't be going through every word of the legislation, but I would like to highlight a few points, is that the city adopted a public notice bylaw, which is permitted pursuant to Section 94.2 of the Community Charter. According to your bylaw, you will post notices in the Nanaimo News Bulletin and on your website, in addition to posting on the public notice posting place. Now, this bylaw is, instead of using Section 94.1 of the Community Charter, which is the default publication requirements. Just want to make it clear, Section 94.1 is not what we're dealing with in this particular situation. Also, to carry out the AAP, you must adhere to the requirements of Section 86 of the Community Charter in order to obtain what they call in general approval of the electors. You can either do that by assent voting or by alternative approval process. Section 86 sets out in general terms the manner to which the AAP is to be conducted, which is talking about how notice is to be given as specified, providing electors with the opportunity to indicate not to proceed, and that there's a time frame established in which the electors may respond and submit elector response forms. At the end of that time period, the corporate officer is going to determine the number of responses, whether they're eligible and valid, and whether the total of them meet the threshold of 10% if there is less than 10% of those elect responses, and this is based 10% on a fair determination of the total number of electors to which the area applies, in this case, your entire community. If it's less than 10%, the city may proceed with whatever the subject matter is, in this case, proceed with adopting the bylaw. Had there been more than 10%, the city must use assent voting in order to determine whether the city may proceed with the subject matter. So the city has the opportunity, should it have been more than 10%, to make a decision, do you wish to proceed or not? If you do, then using assent vote. Some communities, when that has happened, they've decided, nope, we're not going any further. But if you wish to proceed further, you would need to go through an assent vote. Notice is a key component of this process in terms of content, which is prescribed by the legislation, and in terms of the number of times the notice must be published by the established means, in this case, according to your public notice bylaw. Generally, there's a 30-day time period for receiving these responses, and that begins on the date of the second publication of the notice. Okay. And there's also been some amendments that were put in on Section 86 around the time Section 94.2 was added, talking about the second publication occurring on the date when the notice has been published by two of the means of publication set out in the bylaw. Some communities, just so you know, may decide to put, hey, we want three means of publishing. In this case, it would be second notices by two. In your case, you only have two. That's the only where it would be. As well, for additional clarity, the ministry amended its guidelines for alternative approval processes in July 2023 to make it clear that first and second notice of an AAP via Section 94.2 can be published on the same date. It's also important to note the legislation requires the electoral response forms to be established by council in advance and available from the time of the first publication of the notice until the deadline. Okay, I'm just going to touch base to see if there's any questions at this point.
I'm not seeing any. Please continue. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm just going to launch right into AAP number 1. At that time, staff published both notices on the same day of course, in the news bulletin and on the website, and had the elector response forms ready to go on that day. Your time period, which must be at least 30 days, ran a bit longer than 30 days. That's not a problem. The time period had gone through. The corporate officer made the determination that the 10% threshold had not been met. Some citizens raised concern about the way in which the notices were published and also had concerns about that they had not been made aware of the AAP process. Such staff, in light of those concerns and reading through it, trying to figure out what the concern was, staff sought a legal opinion from law firm number 1. That legal opinion indicated that there was merit to those concerns and that there could be a challenge to the validity of the process. Rather than risk a challenge, staff advised council of the situation, and the decision was made to stop AAP number 1 and proceed from there with the second AAP. Subsequently, during AAP number 2, staff sought a legal opinion from law firm number 1 for another AAP, which used the same method of publishing with the same timing as was used for AAP number 1. Law firm number 1 stated, well, that way that was used was defensible. Well, when that occurred, staff went and sought another legal opinion from law firm number 2, which came to a similar conclusion that the way it was used was defensible. However, because AAP number 1 had been abandoned, the city could not revive AAP number 1 while it was dealing with everything for AAP number 2. That was not an option that was open. With regards for AAP 1, in light of the situation, the questions being raised, if you asked me what staff did, and if I had been your staff person, I would have done the same thing your staff did. Seek a legal opinion and follow the advice I was given in spite of any later legal opinions. your staff didn't want to risk it at the time based on the value of the project, the importance of the project to the community, and the public discourse that was happening at that time. At that point, it's easier to start the process again than sit on pins and needles wondering, is this going to be challenged or not? In the knowledge and experience of the lawyer providing that initial opinion would not cause me to question what they were saying. I would not be pushing back saying, well, what about? That's like your staff. I wouldn't have done that. And the other thing to remember at this time is that we have, especially when you're looking at the subsequent legal opinions, we don't have any legal cases right now that specifically say this is how to interpret this legislation. I understand there is a possible case going on in south part of the island over this matter, but right now what you're getting are lawyers looking at it and implying their knowledge to the best of their ability. But until the courts actually come out and say, this is how you will interpret it, this is where you're at. So with AAP number 1, it was just, it was unfortunate about having confidence in your process, that what you were doing worked. But as I said, given that situation, I would have done the same thing and got the legal opinion and followed that legal opinion. Now that takes me to AAP number 2. And I guess to say if something was going to go wrong, it did. It must have been the month of December, because at times it must have felt like a snowball rolling down a hill, getting bigger and bigger each time you turned around. There were several issues or concerns that arose during this process. Due to staffing issues, there was no senior staff member specifically overseeing the conduct of the AAP during the month of December. This is during the time when the preparation was happening. Unfortunately, the corporate officer was not there for several weeks due to personal matters. Your former deputy corporate officer, who retired in July and hadn't been involved with AAP number 1, wasn't familiar with what had happened there and was not there providing supervision over the staff. The person was there to work on special projects and to assist with the general operations of council, in particular dealing with meetings. The person conducting the preparation of AAP didn't have sufficient experience to work on the AAP alone. Plus, this person was also trying to do the work of getting things done for the council meetings and agendas, which can be time consuming. It's December. You may not have everybody there, and indeed that quite often happens at that time. Part of what was done in an effort to try to stem potential complaints that had arisen in the previous AAP, 2 notices were published. January 10th was being seen as a courtesy notice, while January 17th was being seen as the date of the official notice. However, it's important to know that the electoral response forms were not available on either dates. And this makes a difference because, as I mentioned earlier, you have to have that electoral response form ready on the first day, not on the last day with that. The thing is, in fairness, the dates for AAP2 were prepared by staff and they were reviewed by the law firm number 1. At that time, the focus was on the dates that notices were being published and the start time of that 30-day time period in which the electoral response forms were there. Everybody missed the start date for the electoral response forms. There was also some concerns, which makes it rather difficult, is that the behavior exhibited by some members of the public did not make things easier for staff, and it's hard to focus in on the work. Absolutely, the public is entitled to participate in this process, but the manner in which they were participating certainly added to the tension that was going with that. I liken it to when you're driving a car and you're too busy watching everything that's going on the side of the road, you lose focus and you don't see the car in front of you. And that, in essence, is a way of saying that's what happened. the deadlines were missed or key dates were missed. In fairness, one person shouldn't have been working on this AAP by themselves, given that this was a AAP trying to fix the problems that happened the first one, and trying to do more than was anticipated, and try to, take another step to try to address the concerns meant the key requirements that should have been met were missed. Whether or not to use an AAP again, this is my take on it. I recognize trust has been eroded, both externally and internally. Being shy of using this process again, I get that. It would not, third time, is it the charm? You hope so. But the thing I'd like to highlight is that if assent voting were cheap and convenient, there'd be no need for an alternative approval process. Assent votes are costly. They're the equivalent of what you'd pay for an election. They have heavy administrative tasks. If you think trying to do an AAP off the side of your desk is difficult, trying to do an assent vote off the assent voting off the side of your desk, you can't do it. You have to fully commit. It's not a situation where you can wait to have all potential AAP questions addressed by means of assent voting instead at the time of a general election. Anytime you have assent voting other than at the time of a general election, you get extremely low turnout. And moreover, assent voting provides more opportunity for people to challenge the process and more items that could be missed. So my thought is it may be uncomfortable, but I think if you take some steps, you can look to use AAP in the future, but that is for council to make that decision. And what I'd like to do is proceed now into some recommendations.
Is there any questions for Ms. Warren before she goes into the recommendations? Okay, great.
Okay.
Let's proceed.
I think if I could use the word focus as what I'm suggesting through all of this is that an AAP is not just another step to do. It's an important process that really should have the focus placed on it, not just done as something we're trying to get done. When I say that, one of the first things I think is the focus on adequate staffing, that you have at least 2 people. One person may be preparing the documentation, but that you've got a senior person also signing off on that preparation. As well, I would recommend having a person specifically on a communication plan for the AAP, not just a communication plan for the subject matter. I'll get a bit more into that. And look, if timing's, ideally, I recognize that with AAP number 1, you recognize July and August is not the time when the public's around. So you may not get it, have the information dispersed accordingly into the public with that. December, not a great month either. So because you just may not have enough people in the office. So timing can be an issue, especially if you don't have enough people. I would suggest, if it's necessary, providing some additional help so that those focusing on the AAP can do so. It doesn't have to be an extended period of time. Maybe it's you have somebody come in to take care of the regular work that's being done, or somebody come in and focus on the AAP while the rest of staff focuses with there. You'd still have 2 people making sure that it's there, but just to have that kind of sign off, because you do this during the elections. You always have somebody else checking the work to make sure you haven't missed anything. Well, this is something of a similar magnitude. Another recommendation is CYA, check your authority and prepare every time. You may have done this once, twice, 100 times before, but always check your authority. I mean, read the legislation. I mean, go through the ministry guidelines with fresh eyes, even if you've done it before. just to be certain you haven't missed something, because sometimes what you thought you read, you may have missed. Or you think, oh, yeah, I know how to do that. Always checking your authority before you proceed will make sure that you're not missing what you need to do. I'm going to go old school here and suggest when you start figuring out dates and things, you put it on a paper calendar. It's something about that it's easier to count than trying to count the days on the calendar. Once you've got those dates, there's a meeting of the people who are involved. Let's go through those dates, make sure you've got those dates there. I would suggest in the next maybe the next one or two AAPs, have the lawyer also review those dates well. Have that lawyer actually in there go through. Once you've got those dates established, put it in Outlook that's common for the entire Legislative Service Department. This way people won't be missing the dates and we'll see that it's there. It's popping up as nice little reminders. Developing a comprehensive checklist, which takes not only the big tasks that need to be done, but all the little steps that go underneath. Having that checklist there, having the person who did the work sign off, this is what's done on this date. Have the person who's supposed to be checking it sign off on that date so everybody can see what's been done. Another thing is keep it simple. Yes, mistakes were made, but unfortunately, when it comes to a process like this, the standard is perfect compliance with the legislation. The good news is that the AAP is not drafted as complex, isn't as complex as the assent voting. What you got to do is get the notice right, the publication right, and the elector response forms right. So stick what you're required to do in terms of the formal notice and the electoral response forms and not anything more. Now, I'm not saying you don't communicate with the public. I'm not saying that at all, and we'll talk about that in the communications plan. But when it comes to these are the things we absolutely have to do, be crystal clear, focused on those. When it comes to the electoral response forms, have those forms ready to go on the very first day of the notice. One thing you may wish to consider is having one form which can be signed by an individual elector or multiple electors. In essence, kind of a petition, for want of a better term. You can have that because I know there were some issues raised with how many copies should be made available to the public at any one time. Your staff landed on the number 100. Personally, I'd go with less than that. I mean, these are not candies you're handing out at the door at Halloween. This is a serious.
Miss Sworn, I think
You have certainly made it available where people can download it from your website, not just coming to City Hall. So there is that convenience
Miss Sworn.
there.
Excuse me,
Another
Miss
thing
Sworn.
with those electoral response forms, the question has been, well, can we have a situation where somebody can email it in?
Miss Sworn.
Yep.
Oh, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, I can.
Where your connection kind of came in and out, and we missed about a 20-second chunk of what you're saying, and I was wondering if you could go back and maybe just review that last little section.
Absolutely. So I was talking about the electoral response forms. Is that where I cut out at?
Yeah.
Okay. A couple of things. One is make sure they are ready to go on the first day. That without a doubt, they're ready to go. You have them available, like you said, at City Hall and online so people can readily access them. You may wish to consider having one form that can either be signed by an individual elector or multiple electors, kind of petition style. Because I know there was some concerns about, well, the number of copies of individual elector forms, electoral response forms. Your staff wound up on a amount of that one person could ask at any one time, being 100 copies. Personally, I would go with less, but that would be there because these are official documents, not just something to be handed out through there. It's not that hard if you want to go online to download and print that out. Now, there's been some questions like should there be electronic submissions or fax submissions, with the idea that the originals would come back to you at some point as fast. Originals being what we were calling wet signatures, aka we can see the ink with that. The legislation is not clear. What happens if somebody submitted the electronic version within the deadline, but the original didn't show up till after? Well, that's just, the legislation doesn't provide clarity. If the legislation's not providing clarity, there's potential for challenge. So my suggestion would be is that until the legislation is cleared, stick to dropped off forms and mailed in forms to try to avoid any potential arguments about the, whether or not the corporate officer has received it. Because if you've got the one with the original signature, the wet signature, you have it. Now, I would anticipate that there are going to be challenges to the validity of the next AAP process that's used, irrespective of whatever the subject matter is. So I would suggest the city would want to take steps ahead of time. Part of that is just getting the information out ahead of time as to why the subject matter of the AAP is critical for the city and its operations. The reality is legislation doesn't require that you have a communications plan that goes out there, but the fact is there's a very real possibility of misinformation circulating a vote unless the city takes steps to not say you should vote for this, or you shouldn't sign the form, but to say this is what the purpose of the project is. It's not a situation where you can go to knock on every door in the community during that 30-day time period and talk to everybody with that. I know one citizen had suggested that there should be a letter sent to every resident along with an electoral response form. Given the costs, the potential for somebody to say, well, that's the official notice you gave me, it's concerning. I mean, that would be a lot of additional steps that don't keep it simple. I would suggest you want 2 communication plans. That being said, for one's the subject matter and the other is for the AAP. Now, your organization had a plan set out in AAP number 1 and modified it for AAP number 2. I would suggest you want to continue with that. It's a good way of looking at how do we get the message out there. As for the AAP plan, you may want to consider doing the following things to help provide further information for citizens to make up their minds. If you receive an inquiry from a single citizen, summarize the content of it so it can't be traced back to the person who made it, but post that response to the inquiry on the website. Chances are someone else may have it. You've got some really good frequently asked questions. You can add more to it. There were questions that were asked this past one, like can we extend the time frame and that? Put those responses in there and keep that on a steady basis. You've got a wonderful basic AAP website that says, or page that says, here's the process. And then you also have the information for the very specific AAP. That works great. Another thing is someone said, well, I'm going to make a Freedom of Information request to get the information I want. Go for it. But also I would suggest is proactively disclose the response for the Freedom of Information. Chances are if somebody wants that information, they would benefit from seeing that as well. A local government can choose to proactively disclose. And one of the things I would suggest if council's wishes to consider is that it's worth approaching the province to ask for some changes to the legislation in this regard to provide more clarity of exactly what needs to be done when. For example, just the confusion with regards for the notice, maybe asking that, despite the requirements of section 94.2, subsection 5, subsection V, here's the following that will reply. 2 notices published on the day constitutes 2 separate notices, and the electoral response must be made available on that day. There's some other points with that, but a bit more clarity from the ministry may assist both you and other local governments going forward. As a wrap up, as I said, I understand there is a potential court case coming forward, which may take all my recommendations, and because of how the interpretation came out, it may not be suitable going forward. But until that case has occurred, that's it. Those would be my recommendations to council. And I welcome any questions from council.
Thank you very much for that. And we've got a few questions here. Councillor Armstrong?
Thank you, too, if I may through you. I've spent a lot of time talking to a lot of people that were in opposition, and one of the concerns we heard was there was a name change made from Public Works to Nanaimo Operational Center, and people had no clue of what that was. So would that be something that you would suggest is strongly encouraged in the communication plan so people know exactly what they're voting for or against?
Absolutely. It goes back to what I talked about, having a communications plan for the subject matter, and which is in that communications plan is for the city to say, here's the information you need to know. So saying that, yes, it's gone from Public Works to Nanaimo Operations Center, in keeping with the language that is more commonly used now, at least in the industry. Absolutely. I mean, frequently asked questions, perfect one for that one.
And then my second question is, a lot of people thought that an APP process should be used for projects of less significant dollars, such as like have council maybe look at a $40 million or $20 million, for instance, cap before it goes to referendum. Do you have any thoughts on that?
There's a variety of things that can go into play. I understand that dollar figures are huge, especially when it comes to increasing taxes. It boils down to council's comfort level. Absolutely, for simpler things that may be there, because I mean, part of it, removing park dedication. Yeah, that's not necessarily something that people are going to be paying as much attention to as they would for dollar figures. The question is, what's an appropriate dollar figure? Because if you're going to an alternative approval process, it's because you anticipate that if it's because for dealing with borrowing, it's going to be for an extended, for more than 5 years.
And then just my last question, on the communication piece, because we've heard again from people that we should be, proactively collecting for these larger projects. Should it be on there that if the borrowing fails, that we may be forced to raise taxes because, many of us feel this is absolutely necessary, and put in there what the amount is that we would be looking at? Like, let's say 5% for the next 10 years.
Yeah, no, I think the thing is letting people know, if we do this, this is what will happen. If we do this, this is what will happen. In order to allow people, I guess the best way to look at it is to allow the people to make an informed choice about whether they wish to submit an electoral response form, having that type of communication that they can weigh it out. Do I want to have this kind of increase on the taxes, or do I,
Right.
would it be a lesser amount? So having those types of numbers is probably about the biggest thing that people would look for good information to provide there.
Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Councillor Eastmere.
Thank you. Through you, thank you very much for this review. You made a total of 21 recommendations. Appreciate this information. The third recommendation says the city should not engage in a mail-out of a letter about the AAP with an accompanying ERF. Could you please elaborate on that a little bit?
Okay. For a variety of reasons, it could put you in a situation where, first of all, it's not a process you usually use. For your elections, you don't have mail-outs to the citizens that are set with that, because you have the opportunity to vote in any place. So actually knowing what those costs would be, we're not certain of what those costs are. The thing is with, if you're doing a mail out for every AAP, you will need to have money set aside for the budget, or at least some sort of fund that's sitting there just so you have it every time that you need it. The other thing with the mail out is that the question is somebody going to challenge your process because they say, you mailed it out. I didn't get it. I should have had it. I didn't have notice. I need to be informed. It goes back to the keep it simple. Legislatively, what you're required to do for notice is to provide the notice according to your public notice bylaw, and to have those forms ready on those dates. As what I saw, what happened with AAP number 2 is trying to provide more of, here's the forms, here's with this. The focus was so much on trying to provide that additional, going that extra mile, that you missed that step. But if you're, is it critical that you don't send it out there? I would just worry that somebody would be attacking the process because, you didn't send it out.
Thank you. More? Yeah.
Or I didn't receive it, rather, if I was
Second
that
question,
citizen.
if I may, just around the other court case that you mentioned, are you able to offer any insight on that one, and is there an expected time frame for a decision on that?
Alas, no.
Thank you.
Councillor Manley.
Thank you, Chair. Through you, thank you for the very comprehensive report. I appreciate all this information. It's interesting to note that the first AAP was actually a legitimate process, and there was just interpretation between Section 86 and Section 94.2. I'm curious if you're aware of any communities that do a mail out of the electoral response form at all. Are there any communities that do that?
Not that I'm aware of. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but I'm not personally aware of any at this time. I'm just trying to think of comparable. Like, for example, I know with Kelowna goes through the very similar process that you have, is that here's the information, here's that. They've certainly had their hands full with some of their AAPs, but I'm not aware of anyone doing mailouts. But that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. I'm just not aware of it.
And then I know that some communities do allow for electronic submissions, and then that has to be followed, under the legislation, has to be followed with a form with a signature. That's correct?
Well, the legislation doesn't say anything about electronic submissions. Where that information is coming from is the AAP guidelines saying that the councils can make choices through a policy that says, if we're going to have these electronic submissions, this is how the process will undertake. But when you get right down to it, Section 86 isn't that long, and it doesn't talk about electronic submissions or forms or faxed in forms. And I would surmise, and this is just surmising on my point, is that when you start getting more into the election or the potential for an assent vote, which is basically an election on a particular issue, vote on a particular issue, the more you're going to see things that are very precise with that. But the legislation out and out does not talk about electronic submissions. So that would be something that if you wish to do that, you'd need a very robust policy, and I would absolutely have it vetted, because like I said, the concern I would have from a challenge point of view, if I was the corporate officer trying to make a final determination, is that I have this emailed copy. I don't have the original. What have we put for business processes in place for accepting electronic submissions on things? Because this has, it could be that one vote makes the difference. Did we meet the threshold or not? And if it's kind of, if you've always said, hey, we need to have this electronic submission, we need the original to follow up as soon as possible. Well, what happens if it comes after that deadline? then how long do you wait? Is it you wait 1 week if you're willing to accept that? Are you going to wait 2 weeks? 3 weeks? How many weeks are you willing to wait to have that original in there while the corporate officer is going, I need to make a final, a final determination. And how long do you wait on that final determination if you're waiting for the the wet signature copy to show up?
Thank you for that. Is the legislation clear on whether there needs to be a wet signature on the return form?
No, it's not saying anything like that. It just says that the form has to be returned to the corporate officer.
Okay.
And the ministries has put forward that, and as the ministry has said in their guidelines, if you wish to, you definitely want to take additional steps for that.
All right. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the clarity.
Thank you. Councillor Perino.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Ms. Warren. This has been really helpful tonight. The question that I have is, I understand the reasons why sending out a letter is not advisable in your opinion, and my worry with sending out a letter is that it may appear to be a bit of a sales pitch, and that's not what our role is. However, I've been involved in AAPs in the past, and we did use like a newsletter every month, so it became part of the story. So not a sales pitch, more of an information. And what I'm wondering from you is, since you don't recommend a letter, what do you recommend as far as sending out communication pieces? Because I noticed today lots of people don't listen to the radio stations, that are the mainstream ones that some of us would, television. Some of us aren't on some of the social media sites. And to expect the public to just simply look at the city site on a regular basis might be asking more than what the average person is willing to do. And so I'm wondering what your recommendations would be.
If you were to mail something out, I would recommend that it not be the official piece of paper, that it's got all the wonderful language attached to it. If you were, it was like, if you're looking for more information, we have this, here's a nice small little blurb, about what the AAP is about. Here's our website to get more information. If not, please contact these people. If somebody wants to pick up the phone because, for whatever reason, they don't have they don't have a computer.
Okay.
I'm just thinking about my parents, and good luck. I was always the one pulling up the computer for them. But
Yeah.
if you're putting just general information, this is what's happening. If you want more information, here you can find on the website, or you can call this number, and that's part of with having that communications piece.
Okay.
That might be one way of going about it. And maybe you just do it more as like one of those postcards where you can do the, I'm sorry, I can't remember, the bulk mail out rate.
That's right. That's right.
So that would still enable you to get the information out there, but definitely don't make it look like it's the official notice that has been posted. It's
Okay.
for your information.
Thank you. Thank you. That's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very helpful. Good question,
Yeah.
Councillor Perino. Any other more questions from council? Seeing none, Ms. Warren, thank you so much for the comprehensive review and for taking the time tonight to present it and for answering the questions. Much appreciated.
If I may, I'd like to extend a thank you to your CAO, the corporate officer, and the staff who assisted me with providing the information. It was certainly appreciated, very timely, and their willingness to be honest about what happened is certainly appreciated. It made my work a lot easier. So thank you very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to have worked with your organization.
Great, thank you for that.
Okay. If it's all right, I will now disconnect.
Have a good rest of your evening, Ms. Warren. Take care.
Thank you.
This takes us to item number 2, alternative approval process policy options. Ms. Gurry.
Thank you, Chair. And following up on Ms. Warren's report, the report in front of you titled Alternative Approval Process Policy Options is in response to a council resolution from December 4th, 2023, that stated that council requests staff to provide a report and recommendations outlining policy options to improve accessibility and increase the ability of electors to engage in the democratic process when the alternative approval process is used for electoral approval. So outlined in the report, I go through some background and how staff received much feedback from a number of different sources, from the first AAP that Ms. Warren was speaking about that we held in September 2023, and the second AAP that was held in January 2024. So a number of members of the public, council provided feedback that they had received from members of the public and shared with staff. Staff heard it themselves. So this was included but not limited to mail-in and electronic forms, should they be allowed, email responses, more open houses, clarity around the project requiring the borrowing, notification and communication around the AAP process and the project, education around the borrowing process, and mail drops to all households. So a lot of the things that you just were discussing with Ms. Warren. Before our investigation was complete into this feedback, a second AAP was held for the borrowing bylaw for the Public Works Building, Nanaimo Operations Center, in January of 2024, and efforts were made to further increase communication and engagement during that second AAP process. The feedback received from council and the public, I believe, was positive. It allowed for a lot more tours at Public Works, a lot more communication and education on both the project and the AAP process, and most of the feedback that I was able to hear, even at this meeting, at these meetings, council meetings, was positive. So, and attached to this report is all of the initiatives that we undertook for AAP number 2, a summary of those initiatives in the communication and engagement plan. So as outlined in the report as well, long-term borrowing by a municipality is one of the matters considered by council that requires approval of the electors in accordance with the community charter. The two methods that can be used to obtain approval of the electors is either by an assent vote, otherwise known as a referendum, or by the alternative approval process. These processes are both subject to provincial legislation that local government must follow. So the alternative approval process, a guide for local governments in British Columbia, is the provincial guidelines that Ms. Warren was talking about. They've been brought up before in previous meetings regarding the AAP, and they set certain processes. They outline where a local government can set certain processes out in policy, where it's not clearly prescribed in the legislation. So areas where there is a possibility for variables, where a local government can go above and beyond, basically are the engagement communication portions of an AAP process, and procedures for providing and accepting response forms. Those are really the three areas where it's not completely prescribed. Here are the legislation, here are the rules, here's what you must do. There's some variables allowed in those three sections. So it's not recommended that legislative requirements that I just said that are clearly prescribed and outlined in the community charter for holding an AAP be included in a policy. Rather, it should be set out in procedure, as Ms. Warren was talking about, internal staff procedures, where we have the procedure for here's the prescribed legislation to follow, here's how we should carry it out, here are the steps, here are the task lists, here are the checks and balances, etc. But rather, in the policy, it should just set out the flexible parts of the process. So examples of where there is prescribed legislation that I don't recommend being included in a policy would be when approval of electors is required and the method to obtain that approval. So that is a council decision that should be brought to you each and every time. If approval of the electors is required, it's up to you as council to decide whether that should be done by an alternative approval process or an assent vote. So that shouldn't be determined in a policy. I believe that is a council decision, and the legislation sets out that council must decide which process to go through. The bylaw required for the approval, so what needs to be included in that bylaw, that's prescribed by legislation That shouldn't be set out in a policy. When to give readings to the bylaw, approval from the Inspector of Municipalities prior to the AAP process commencing, notice requirements, certification of responses, adoption of the bylaw, the second approval from the Inspector of Municipalities, again, after the adoption of the bylaw, et cetera. Those things are clearly outlined in the legislation, and it's not recommended that they be included in a policy. Other parts of the process that aren't recommended to be set in policy would be, like I just mentioned, actually, so I'm repeating myself, whether it should be an AAP versus a referendum, and because that is said in the legislation that council should make that decision, as well as the time period for an AAP. This should be a direction of council that's made at that decision. Okay, council's decided to have an AAP, this is the time frame, and this is the 30-plus days. So is it 30 days, is it 30-plus days? That shouldn't be prescribed in a policy, because the timing of the AAP could be around holidays, et cetera, that just wouldn't work. Like, it could end on a Saturday, the 30, if you set it at 33 days, the last day could be a Saturday, which just wouldn't work. So I don't suggest that be set out in a policy, rather decided on a case-by-case basis. So also included in the report for council's consideration is what is recommended that could be considered for inclusion in a policy. That would be to have staff create a communications and engagement plan for the AAP process that is contiguous with the communications plan for the project. So two separate communications and engagement plan. One that would focus on the project, what the project is about, what the money is being borrowed for, and one on the AAP process. What is the process? What are the methods of participating in the process? Two communications plan that would come to council, be endorsed by council on a case-by-case basis. That would be set in the policy, but council would approve that communication and engagement plan each time. So in the policy, it would say that we would come to you each time. And set 100 forms per day per person as the limit of forms provided to citizens during the AAP period, so that there is citizens don't need to come to council to say, you know, the corporate officer says I can only have 100. What's your take on that? If it's clearly set out in the policy, that just allows me to do my job and set the amount provided for that I can provide. Further to these options, and as noted in the report, staff are seeking your direction for the inclusion of mailouts, and the costs are listed in the staff report that are a couple months old now, and they are approximate, but we have reached out to get costs for direct mail to homeowners or a Canada Post flyer drop, keeping in mind what Ms. Warren said about the risks and maybe what possibly should be mailed out. There is also outlined in the report is electronic submissions and what could be considered in a policy and what we're not recommending be considered in a policy. We did a lot of work with our IT department, and as everyone's aware, cybersecurity is a very serious and current event topic going on in our world today, and having attachments to emails, PDF attachments to emails, is a cybersecurity risk for viruses, etc. However, we could have those uploaded onto our website that has either a photo and or a scanned copy of the PDF with the signature there. That is something that we could consider. That would be more time consuming, just honestly, because we do have to reconcile that we're not receiving an electronically submitted form as well as an in-person form, so we have to reconcile that we're not getting duplicates. We don't recommend at this time a fully electronic form that you could fill out and do DocuSign, because as noted in the report, per DocuSign signature, it's $3 to $4, and we have no way of limiting the amount of submissions one person could do. So for risk of abuse of that system, it could become very costly, so we're not recommending until we can set up some parameters to ensure one submission per person. We don't recommend that. And then also, as noted by Ms. Warren and noted in the report, under financial implications of these considerations for you, is the cost for an AAP related to a borrowing bylaw could significantly increase based on options included in this policy, should you choose to include them in a policy. Flyer drops or direct mail from Canada Post range between $11,500 to $37,650, and that doesn't include the risks associated that Ms. Warren brought to your attention. But the true cost increases would not be known until a comparison between a future AAP with these new methods applied versus previous AAPs that have been done. So we wouldn't know the true cost increases until or unless we applied these new methods and did a cost comparison. AAPs are included annually in the Legislative Services budget. If you go back 10, 15, 20 years, there's an annual budget allocated for AAPs for removal of park dedication, other reasons that AAPs are required. We do a lot of AAPs. By a lot, I mean 1 to 2 a year and is an average. So there is a set budget. The assent vote or referendums are not budgeted annually. However, they have been in the last 2 years because of capital projects that Council has set as priorities. We have put a budget for an assent vote, aka referendum, in our budget for the last 2 years because Council might have chosen to have one and might still choose to have one. So they have been budgeted for. They aren't regularly though. So those are some considerations. I'd be happy to answer any questions, and thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So I do have a bunch of questions. Do we want to do the delegation first, or just go these questions? All right, great. So I'll start on the list. My screen is blowing up here. Mayor Crowe.
Thank you very much, Chair, and appreciate the presentation of Ms. Sworn and Ms. Gurry. Basic question, can you tell Council how many AAP forms were actually received in both the first and second process? I'm not asking how many were actually certified, in other words, they were reviewed and determined to be valid, but how many were actually received in each process?
Through the chair, to your worship, I can tell you what I did certify in AAP number 1. I think it was around 3,025. I don't have the number right in front of me, I'm sorry, your worship, but I believe it was 3,025 of the 78 or 900 that would be the 10% threshold. In the second AAP, it was canceled a week short, but I believe there was around 2,700 at the end of that.
And can you tell us, please, what actually happens when the form is received at City Hall? Who sees it? Who gets to review it? How many people's hands does it pass through, and what's done with it when it's been certified? And what happens to it after the process is finished?
Thank you, Worship. So that is clearly outlined in the legislation and the provincial guidelines. The corporate officer has to receive the forms and is allowed to have legislative services staff help with that process. So, and it's up to the corporate officer to keep those forms safe. And that is why, as I stated a meeting or so ago, that scrutineers are not able to be there at the count because it's not a secret ballot. There's private information on those forms that are prohibited from disclosure under the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. And that's stated in the guidelines as well as the legislation. So they are kept safe in our vault every night, which is another reason outlined in my report why they have to be returned to City Hall and not other locations, because logistically getting them in my hands every night to keep them safe in a vault would be logistically hard to ensure I got them all every night. And then for the count, I'm allowed to have my staff assist me with that, and I can count, so I do that myself.
And if I may, Chair, just one more. For practical purposes, the form that we receive at City Hall, or rather you receive in fairness, it's not seen by members of council, it's not seen by the mayor, and in fact contains the signature of the individual involved and their address, correct?
That is correct, and they're in a ballot box in our vault, and nobody sees them.
So highly personal information. My signature doesn't circulate around town too much, so it gives me some comfort to know that it's received by a limited number of staff. Appreciate the opportunity for the questions, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Brown.
Thanks so much, Chair. Quick question through you to Ms. Gurry. Where's the 100 picked out from? And if it's just out of nowhere, is there any recommended amount?
Thank you, Chair, through you to Councillor Brown. 1,000 was requested, 1,000 every day by a few citizens, which takes a lot of paper, a lot of printing. We do have a bylaw that charges for copies. The legislation says every citizen is entitled to a response form.
Okay.
So I found a saw-off of 100 as being fair. And so that it's not in the legislation other than every elector is eligible to have a response form or is entitled to a response form. Some municipalities have limited them to 15 throughout the whole 30-plus days, not per day, some 25. We did some surveying of other municipalities. You could choose to go less than that. I just stuck with the 100 that I did in the last AAP when writing the recommendation.
Right, and just a quick follow-up, if I may, Chair. So, okay, thank you for that. Feel free to comment on this or not, but it seems like the intention of the legislation is just simply that folks can have access to a form if they wish to have one. Is that correct?
Yes, that's my interpretation.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Brown. Councillor Armstrong.
Thank you. Just a couple questions. When I was talking about sending notices out, I wasn't talking about sending out the form. It's about like when we do get our user rate bills, like, you know, not everybody does, I understand that. But if we know we have upcoming major capital projects, I don't see why we can't put a notice in the form saying, beware, we've got a capital project coming up, whether it be water main replacements, whether it be whatever, so that that notification is just another additional things for homeowners to be aware that this is coming down the pipe. It's not about sending the form, it's just be aware it's coming up. If you want more information, you can join with, I don't know if it's Get Involved in Anamo or whatever, I can't remember what all our different sites are, or like she said, go to the site. I think communication is something that we really need to work on. I think it was much better the second time around. I think people don't understand the process. And I think by doing more around that, saying, you know, this is why we're doing this, and showing the difference between, and I know Ms. Mercer did at one time, if we borrow now, this is how much it's going to cost us, this is why we suggest it, because it spreads the cost through the new residents, whatever, where there's other residents I've talked to that would rather us, hey, tax me right now, because I don't want to spend the extra $40 million in what do you call it, interest. Yeah. So I think it's really important that we do a much better job at communication. I think we've all learned from this process. I also think one thing that did hurt us was a lot of people didn't know what the Nanaimo Operations Center was, and there was a lot of miscommunication around that. So I think if we worked on that, that would make a big difference. As number of forms, I'm not that concerned about that because people can get it, but at this stage, I'm not in favor of electronic forms for the simple fact there's not enough security around it, and I worry about people, you know, just sending them in yes or no without having really good checks in place. So thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Thorpe.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. I appreciate the information from Ms. Gurry, and I especially appreciated Ms. Warren's report, which I found very comprehensive and informative, and answered a lot of my questions about the process. I guess my comments would be this, and I want to come back to Ms. Warren's report in a moment. The city followed the process laid out under legislation and the community charter and provincial guidelines. And the first AAP we ended up canceling out of an abundance of caution is how I would term it. But staff acted in good faith. And it's unfortunate that some citizens did not seem willing to accept that. And I apologize for some of the comments that you and your staff received Ms. Gurry, because you did act in good faith. I'm confident of that. We followed a recognized process. Other communities are following the same process as we speak. It's commonly used. It is not something that we dreamt up. It's not a conspiracy theory to deceive people. It's a commonly used government practice. So I quite frankly think that we as a city and as a council should stop apologizing. We did the best we could. Some mistakes were made in the second process. We've learned from those mistakes, and we'll remedy them as we go forward. Coming back to the staff recommendation, which I realize is not on the table yet, and we still have a delegation, I would like to comment, though, at this point, that I feel the recommendation is a little too specific for my liking. And I would be quite happy if it said, recommendation number 1, that the Governance and Priorities Committee recommends staff return to council with a policy for their consideration that includes reference to the topics commented on by Ms. Warren. I don't think we need to be specific to talk about the number of 100 potential forms that we give out or anything else. I think we need to leave it to staff to come back with what they feel is a good policy based on the expert advice that we have received. So again, I realize I'm premature in my argument on this, but I might look to ask council to consider a more general recommendation to vote on when we come to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Thorpe. Councillor Perino.
Thank you, Chair. And actually, I really appreciated your comments, Councillor Thorpe, and I couldn't agree more. But what I wanted to make sure that what we were doing tonight is simply recommendations for a policy. This is not, we're not making any recommendations tonight about setting up another AAP or referendum for whatever. That is not the discussion tonight. This is simply to put policies in place to help us to better administrate future AAPs or future referendums should the situation. It's just, you know, given the delegation that we're going to hear, which is great. I don't have any problem with that. I just want to make sure that the public knows we're not discussing the AAP that we went through before. This is strictly to discuss the policies so that we move forward in a better manner. Is that correct?
Through the chair to Councillor Perino, absolutely. In fact, it's only considerations for a policy that would then come back to you for approval. So it's not even approving a policy at this point.
That's right.
It's just for options to include in a policy that would then come back to you for your approval.
Got it. Got it. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Eastmere.
Thank you. Through you, I'm just wondering why the options, why staff chose not to address recommendation 21 that the city requests that the province amend the applicable legislation pertaining to AAPs to remove the issues that have arisen during this one.
Through the chair, so the recommendation was for a policy, so that would be something, I think, outside of what would be included in the policy, but mainly, and honestly, because I didn't have Ms. Warren's report until after I wrote my report, because it was separate. My report was to deal with policy options for you, and her report was to do a review post-mortem of AAP number 1 and 2. So I didn't have her recommendations to include.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, totally appreciate that, and I think that this will be a really important piece to include because, you know, from her report, it mentioned that the local government must rely on the actual wording of the legislation rather than any instructions provided by the ministry through its guidelines. And I'm like, wow, that's concerning, like setting us up for failure. If you read the guidelines, I think, yeah, that's a piece that we ought to address for our sake and for the sake of other local governments going through this.
Definitely
So I'll make a separate motion.
Good point of advocacy. Thank you, Councillor Eastmere. Councillor Hemmons.
Thank you, Chair. Great comments, and Councillor Eastmere, thank you for picking up on that. I think that's something we certainly need to address, and I think it actually goes to my thinking on this when I heard Ms. Gurry say that wasn't the intent of the motion, which formed the report and the basis of the recommendations here tonight. And I'm sorry, I'm just asking you guys to follow me here for a sec. An AAP is set out in legislation. This is a tool we can use. I'm hearing Ms. Gurry say we need to determine how we're going to seek approval, whether it's AAP or Ascent, the time frame for the AAP. These are things that we already determine those if we're going to, that has to be determined by us. So that probably doesn't have applicability in a policy. So what we're looking at are communication and engagement plans and how many forms. And I'm just kind of questioning the validity of writing a policy when we say that we've learned a lot, we will practice differently. Staff have delivered a report based strictly on a motion that we made that, you know, I think was made with the best of intention to say something went wrong. We recognize something went wrong. We want staff input. And now I'm hearing staff's input say we would kind of have this bit of a weak policy because really it's set at a higher level. And so I wonder if there's just some comments on that, please.
Through the chair, I think where a policy would be helpful is to keep in mind a couple things. This could be over future councils that are dealing with this, and it helps staff rather than re-debating the same question, for example, on are we going to do electronic submissions. If we had a policy that said at this time the city does not use electronic submissions for AAPs, and the policy would say that we would have a specific communication strategy developed depending on the nature of the AAP, that would at least put that question that would put that question to bed. And I think the other questions that got raised around, and I think the question tonight, well, why did Muskerry select 100? It'd be nice to have that in council policy somewhere rather than staff trying to defend at the front counter why they think 100 is the right number. So I think there is a need for a general policy, but I think the most important part of that policy that would be that there should be a communication strategy that's reflective of the scale and nature of the AAP that's coming forward to council, that each council would then approve as part of the AAP process.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Another question, if I may. When we feel like we got the communication right, that was the second AAP, correct? And did that include a communication stream about the AAP itself as well as the project? And is that where this recommendation was generated from, that new understanding of this is what works well? I'm asking because we're going to put into policy something that we saw succeed. Is that an accurate statement?
Through the chair to Councillor Hemmens, I believe so. I believe if we come back with a communications plan, like Mr. Lindsay said, that is equal to the scale and scope of the project, but then also has for the communications plan for the AAP, which would be separate from that communications plan, which would outline, I found that the educating and explaining around the borrowing and the process for an AAP, what the process is and what it isn't. Like, no, we don't shred the forms. It is safe to bring them into City Hall. It is a democratic process. I'm not an elected official that's collecting your forms and keeping them, like, just kind of explaining what the process is, the legislation, the notice requirements. I found a lot of people after I spoke with them and explained the process and the communications that we did in the second AAP, a lot of people were like, wow, I didn't know that, or wow, that's not what I was hearing. So as outlined in my report, I think it's really important to have that educational piece and that process communication out there that's just as strong as the project communication and engagement plan.
Thank you, and I'm just kind of chuckling to myself, Ms. Gurry, as we were at the information session that was all about the AAP, and you could have swung a cat around in the room and no one was there, and was that a failure of our communication to say that that opportunity was available, or I'm just not, yeah, so thank you for the advice of the CAO. I appreciate that input. I'm happy to support a policy based on those recommendations, but I still want to register some reservations around this, feeling that this is a process that's laid out in legislation, and I'd be curious, actually, did you discover in your research other municipalities or jurisdictions that have policies that apply to the delivery of AAPs?
Through the chair to Councillor Hemmens, very few.
Right. I can see why. Yeah. Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Just a reminder, we do have a delegation, and good to hear from them and then continue on the discussion. Councillor Manley.
Flip my mic on. Thank you. Thank you, Chair. I'm curious about, through you to staff, about One of the things in Ms. Zorn's report was about the multiple forms and the information that people would have access to if people are filling out those forms or taking them around like a petition. And I'm wondering when people are collecting these forms, when they come in and get 100 forms, are they advised that it's a violation of the Privacy Act to be collecting the data as they're doing that?
Through the chair to Councillor Manley. So that was concerning to my staff. As you know, we also look after the Freedom of Information Protection and Privacy Act, and we're not allowed to disclose those forms or share those forms with anyone or collect information. Even though the city is a huge collector of personal information, like, I mean, we collect taxes on behalf of the entire city, and we're not allowed to use that information that we've collected for that purpose, for another purpose. So, just because we have everybody's address, we can't then use that information to send out, solicit them information about an AAP. So yes, it was concerning. However, I looked into it to ensure that it wasn't us breaching personal information, and it was not us breaching personal information. The petition style can be concerning. Some people are hesitant to sign it because their personal information is then seen by anyone else signing the form. So that is a consideration when deciding what kind of response form to have available. So we opt with the more conservative single response form because it's not a secret ballot, like I mentioned earlier. So yeah, I think that if people were picking up those forms and taking them out and having people sign and collect them, that they should be making those folks aware that, that especially if they're going to use that information, they should be making those folks aware.
That they're using the information? Yeah. Is that not a violation of the Privacy Act?
It would be if they didn't have consent. So right. It would be but it wouldn't be the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, because that's for public bodies. But if it was a business doing this or an individual, it's the Personal Information Privacy Act.
That they would be data mining. Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you, Councillor Manley. Yeah, that brings us to our delegation. Mr. Bartlett.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. It's good to see you again. This is as you're aware, this is a process that's kind of near and dear to my heart. I'd like to comment generally about the consultant's report and some of the comments I've been hearing tonight. I'm encouraged that you're reviewing this process. It's a difficult process. As much as everybody says, keep it simple, I think the provincial government, the way that they've set this process up, it's anything but simple. I want to get into a couple of other things about the spirit and intent of the legislation, not just the legislation. In order for the city to consider doing an AAP process, I know that you explained that you undergo a number of considerations, and one is, I think the mayor's comments were, they're for needs, not wants. So during your policy making session, I'd like you to consider that as well, and make that part of your policy, that the AAP process should be for needs of the city, not any wants or those types of wants. Okay, sir, sorry. So I just bring that to your attention because I think that's a really serious consideration. And the wants that you want to have in the city can be dealt with through the referendum process, which is, I think, what Mayor Krogh was getting at when he was defining the differences between needs and wants. The next issue that I wanted to raise with you is that the consultant was, I thought the consultant's report was comprehensive too, so good. But it dealt with the AAP process in a very narrow and restrictive way. The report itself dealt with recommendations that will assist the administration at the city, which is good because I think we need good administration at the city. But it didn't really address, and it doesn't address, and I haven't heard many comments tonight about what the spirit and intent of the legislation is. The intent of the legislation is to get a feel from your citizens as to whether or not they're opposed to a certain borrowing bylaw. In order for you to get that from your citizens, it's necessary for you to make sure that the citizens are notified. I know all about the deemed notification provisions in the Act, but that doesn't assist you in making sure that your citizens are notified. It doesn't assist you in making sure that your citizens understand what it is that you're doing with their money, and it doesn't make the citizens understand all the other things that are necessary for them to make an informed decision as to whether or not they're going to oppose this project, now, or a project. Now, it's simple if you want to support the project. The idea is you don't give a form in. It's a very simple process. Don't provide a form. But in order to make a conscious decision as to whether or not you're going to provide a form, you have to know about the process and you have to understand what it is. So I see that as the biggest challenge for the city when they're forming their policy. And I never heard anything about that, heard very little about that. And I think that that's something you should concentrate on as a council. You've got an electorate that, and I can assure you, I'm out there, and I've talked to a lot of people, and you've got an electorate that still is very unaware of what an AAP process is. There's thousands now that are aware. You've managed to get some opposition forms in. There are probably thousands more that support the position that the borrowing should occur, that don't deliver forms. But it's certainly not to the extent that you should make sure that they are informed. Everyone in the city should be aware of this. And I know that there might be a few people that might not be aware because they're not even interested in this process. They don't really care about it. But the vast majority of people are very interested in what you're doing with their money and how much more in taxes they have to pay every year. Every year they go through tax increases, and they're very concerned about the tax increases that they've got. So this is a very serious matter for citizens, and it has to be taken seriously by the council. So the policy should include what I call the 3 Ps. It's project, price, and process. The project has to be clearly defined and has to be devoid of any wants. It should only contain needs. And you should, as a policy decision...
Mr. Bartlett, just, you've hit your 5 minutes. I'll give you another minute here.
Okay, thank you.
But just give you a warning. Thanks.
Yeah.
Got a minute.
In connection with the project description, there should be a very clear definition of the price. In the process, I've already explained, you need to address the issues that the citizens are expressing, that they're not getting the information they need in order to make an informed decision. Some of them don't even have any idea what the process is. So if you want an accurate reflection of what your citizens want, you got a lot of work to do. And I think your policy, whatever policy you adopt, should reflect that. Last thing I want to say is that, in a wrap-up, is I know the city council and the staff work hard for the city. I know they do the right thing that they think is right. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing the job the citizens want you to do. So I don't think anybody's questioning your good faith or the good faith of the people that work at the city. I think they're questioning whether or not you're doing enough and taking their concerns enough into consideration when you form policy. If you form a policy that addresses these concerns and actually gives notice to people of what you're doing with their money, I think you'll find it's a lot simpler process. The last comment I'll make is, I know you were asking questions, and please ask me a question about the legal matter, and that's underway.
Great, thank you. Do we have any questions for Mr. Bartlett? Councillor Armstrong.
Thank you. Yeah, I just did the legal matter. If you could give us, if you know when it's going to trial or court, because that may be important for us around policy, et cetera.
Yes, in fact, it is me. I'm the lawyer on the case that is before the Supreme Court in Victoria. It's with respect to a bylaw of the Capital Regional District. And in that case, it's going to be about the central issues that were in AP number 1 in Nanaimo. Now, while I heard some things about it was a legitimate process, it was this, it was that, well, I don't know who can say it was a legitimate process. Certainly, the court has described it as a very important matter that needs to be dealt with. They thought it was so important that we had scheduled to go for 2 hours, and Madam Justice Power bounced us over for a full day. So there will be a decision. The full day hearing is going to be on September 3rd. The matter will be resolved before the court, Supreme Court. You will get some guidance from the court on that matter, and I'm hoping that will clarify for a lot of us as to what the AAP process and notice and all those things are about. One of the key issues is and one of the things I think you can, and I know it's taking a long answer, but one of the key issues is, and one of the things you can take into consideration in your policy is the statutory minimums don't describe what's necessary in order to conduct a fair and open and transparent AAP process. It only describes what you legally must attain in order to have an AAP process. It's all described as bare minimums. So 30 days for return of response forms. I'm of the firm opinion that 90 days is a much more accurate time frame for people to return those response forms. Some people aren't around. Some people aren't available. Some people don't know about the process. Give them 90 days. It's not going to hurt anything. It's allowed for in the legislation. The city can adopt a policy for 90 days for the return of the response forms. And I think it's a much more fair process to the citizens to have more time than the 30 days that the bare minimum that's set out in the legislation. The legislation begs for more than 30 days. It says it's at least 30 days. It opens the door to the council. It allows you to use your discretion to determine for your community how much time should we give our community. Should we give them the bare minimum of 30 days? Or should we take into consideration that they don't really know what's going on here and there's not enough time to have the response forms returned? And if you're talking about individual response forms, and I'm going to give you another example
Mr. Bartlett,
how unfair this is.
Appreciate the lengthy
Support,
response, and I don't want to cut you
I'm
inappropriately short, but we've been very generous. Yeah.
I tried to work it into the question, but there you go.
Thank you. Well,
any further questions?
Not seeing any other further questions, but I want to appreciate your time for bringing this forward, and it'd be interesting the outcome of the court case, and more clarity in the provincial legislation would be greatly appreciated. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, council. Yeah, we can open it up here for some discussion, and then entertain some motions. I've got Councillor Brown, and then Councillor Armstrong, Eric Rowe. Councillor Brown. And
thanks so much, Chair, and thank you for staff for the many times we've had information on this, and the most recent outside information as well. Much appreciated. Just kind of taking it all in over the period in which it unraveled, I very much am supportive of a policy and do think we should have one. The reason so is, yes, I think any policy crafted would be very mindful of the items not to cover with respect to the pitfalls of how that might interface with legislation and produce problems, especially after recent experience. But I do think policy is important for laying out considerations and options for a council to consider, whether it's this council or subsequent councils, Just because I remember a lot of questions that emerged, both in the meeting and in individual conversations, both with community members, but I think importantly with council around what are some of the options? What should we be considering? And having a policy in place like that, one, it's something that can point to. Two, it doesn't handcuff any given council. It would simply outline a process in which they can consider numerous factors as they decide upon things such as the engagement plan, you know, the bylaw consideration, the timing, all those sort of things. So I do think that's important because it helps point people to the right questions to be asking at a meeting when any AAP is being considered. Just kind of going through here. I do think there is a difference between projects on scope and scale, and also the impact it may have to cities' finances. You know, there's going to be times where I think undoubtedly the communication and the engagement is going to be rather minimal, just based on the scope and scale of the project. I think there's other times where you know, the level of borrowing would be so significant that it's not just particularly about that project. It's about, hey, if you go down this path, there's going to be some cost benefit with respect to how that might impact other projects, with just respect to your finances and your taxation levels and your ability to borrow. I think those are important times to check in with the electorate, and it's a little bit different of a conversation when a project is of a scale that if you do it, it's going to impact your ability to do or not do other things. With respect to the forms, in general, I agree with Councillor Thorpe's comments that we should send this back to staff to craft something and just be not overly prescriptive. But just due to the exclusion and how this unfolded, I think it would be appropriate for the GPC to provide that clarity for staff and just take ownership over that, especially because it became such a lightning rod and staff were very unfairly treated by certain members of the public on that. I'll be very clear, nothing, I was present in the lobby for some of those interactions, just sitting in a chair and seeing them go down. I'll be nice, but they were shameful and ridiculous. And I agree with Mr. Bartlett to a certain degree that most part folks have some good faith around intentions and not necessarily always in agreement with the process or the outcomes of both staff or council. But I also can point out, even in this very meeting, there's a sign that's suggestive that council is knowingly or unknowingly committing treason. That's not necessarily a widespread belief, but I do think it is evidence that the good faith is not shared by everyone. And some of that toxicity definitely spilled out through this process. And I think, you know, council's one thing, elected to take that, but you know, staff are just showing up to do their job and their work and not deserving of any of that. So I think that number should be set, and I think it should be set at 20 forms per person for the entire duration. I think 100 is pandering to the worst part of that process. Finally, I do think that a policy should outline the options that could be available for a particular council around mail-out options and electronic submissions. Again, that's not to suggest that the council may do that. It's only simply to make them aware that that possibility does exist and they may wish to consider it for a certain type of project. So taken all together, I think all those things would help furnish both the public and future council with the right questions to be asking staff and to consider as part of a project. No policy binds them in any regard, just like none of our policies bind us unless it's in a bylaw. And then finally, I think that we do need to follow up, although not part of this. I hope Chair and Council will entertain a motion tonight. The importance of this being that the deadline for submissions to UBCM is June 30th, and I do think this warrants a motion that could go forward to Council and be submitted for the 2024 annual convention, simply outlining the issues around the clarity and process of the legislation that governs the alternative approval process. It's just one of those things. It's a legacy item. It hasn't been updated to modern times, and the scope and scale of its use is just not reflected in legislation, like so many other of the bits in there. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Council.
Thank you, Councillor Brown. Councillor Armstrong.
Thank you. I agree with everything Councillor Brown said pretty well, other than I don't agree with putting in inclusion of mail-out options or electronic, as I don't believe we should be doing that at this stage. I don't think we are far enough along, and I'm cognizant of Ms. Sworn saying about the issues that could do if we did do a mail-out response. So I would just prefer that number 2 not even be in there right now. And then if, as we get progressing along through electronic stuff, whatever, then a further council could always add in there. But I don't think we should have mail-out options at this time, nor do I think for response forms, nor do I think there should be electronic submission of response forms until we get more clarity around ensuring the validity of stuff. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Armstrong. Mayor Krog.
Thank you very much, Chair. For me, this is going back to basics. We exist under the Canadian Constitution because provincial governments create us. We run on rules that are passed by the legislature in Victoria. We operate in accordance with the law. We have limited jurisdiction and limited taxation authority. We live and exist, all of us, in a system of responsible government. That doesn't mean every citizen gets to vote on every issue every time in society. We are elected as members of council to act responsibly to and on behalf of the citizens who elect us. It disappoints me to no end that so few bother to vote. As most of us know, 39% turnout in 2018, roughly a little under 24% in 2022. It is our job to manage the city's funds. It is our job to ensure taxes are collected and the money is spent on what we believe or think is in the best interest of the general public. The alternate approval process is basically a restriction, if you will, or an opportunity, I suppose, for the citizens to express their concern around a particular financial matter and to be quite specific, around long-term borrowing for specific projects. That's the concept. Otherwise, we make those decisions. This is an opportunity for the citizens to express themselves accordingly, and they can do so through an alternate approval process. Now, I am a huge believer in voting and a huge believer in the privacy of the ballot, and I must say the concept that someone comes in, picks up 100 forms, and presumably wanders around to 100 citizens, probably not their friends, gets their address and their personal and private information, including their signature, and then has control of that information, I find actually almost repugnant and frightening. In a world that's concerned about privacy, I would think that's rather terrifying. Whereas what happens at City Hall when you bring in that form, it is limited to a restricted number of people. No one knows how you vote. So I'm with Councillor Brown. Why, given that you can download, if you wish, 100 or 1,000 forms on your computer if you have access to a printer, would we be responsible to deliver 100 forms a day to an individual, and in theory, over a 30-day period at a minimum, 3,000 forms to an individual who may or may not fill them out appropriately, and those signatures have to be verified. I'm concerned about the concept of people canvassing on this issue. Quite frankly, who's to say Len Krog doesn't go out as a false canvasser and say, I'm here to canvass, and I get your signature, and you think, oh yes, I voted against this project, and I just go and garbage it. Nobody seems to have worried about that aspect of this, let alone, as I say, all the private information. So personally, I would, as a sense of compromise, I think 10 or 15 is more appropriate. Must say I am somewhat moved on this issue by the obnoxious behavior of people who came into City Hall, some of which I witnessed, and how our staff were abused around this issue, which included attempting to stop me leaving the parking lot while this individual took their sweet time arguing with a woman who I thought they knew, who turned out to be a complete stranger who was being harassed around this issue. So, having said that, it did not bring out the best in this community, and some of the behaviors were appalling. But I'm not basing my position on that. I am basing my position on this simply. It is a process to enable a reasonable portion of the voters in a community to express their opposition to a decision that council has made. We don't put these things out because we want people to oppose the project. We put it forward because as council we have decided in our wisdom with the advice of staff and exercising the responsibility the electorate gives us to bring forward the proposition that we borrow money for a specific project. One has to assume that council supports it. We don't throw these things out willy-nilly. So this is an opportunity for the voters to say, we happen to disagree with your judgment, even though we elected you to exercise that judgment and act responsibly and listen to staff and read reports and pay attention to things. So having said that, extending it to 90 days, as Mr. Bartlett suggested, I think is preposterous, with great respect. What's the length of an election period, federal, provincial, or municipal? How much time does one need? And if a sufficient number of signatures are obtained in opposition, then we are stuck with a referendum, and council may well be mortally embarrassed by it, but that's okay. But my understanding is, from Ms. Gurry's response tonight, we didn't even come near the number of signatures that were required that would have actually been accessible. And that was in 2 processes, and surely the media coverage and everything involved in it would indicate that, in fact, the majority of the citizens of Nanaimo either didn't care or trusted council or indeed supported a long-standing project, the arguments for which I will not repeat tonight, which we have heard articulated by Mr. Sims and Mr. Rosen and various other individuals before us on many times, including reports. So, for what it's worth, I look forward to a policy. I am not in favor of 100 forms per day per person. I think if you're responsible and you take your citizenship seriously and you think it's worth opposing this, then print off your own form or come to City Hall and pick it up and hand it in. But don't pretend that this is some minor exercise. When we're talking about the safety of our workers, the ability for our equipment and our workers to be safe and our equipment to withstand a major catastrophic event when the citizens will be relying on those workers and the equipment available, I think it's something that needs to be taken seriously. I emphasize my remarks are around this particular process only, but there will be other processes as well. So, those are my views on this, and we should get a motion on the floor at some point, Chair, but we'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Councillor Thorpe.
Thank you very much, Chair. And again, as the Mayor has just pointed out, we have no recommendation or motion on the table at this moment, and I'm not prepared to put one on the table yet because of my earlier comments, and I want to come back to them. I'm absolutely in favor of having staff develop a policy for us based on expert advice. And I agree with subset A or paragraph A in the recommendation about method of communication engagement be considered on a case-by-case basis. However, I personally disagree with the 100 forms per day per person. I think that's absurd, and I agree with the comments of Councillor Brown earlier. I would limit it even further than he suggested it. But number 2 in the recommendation is for us to provide staff direction on a number of the details in the weeds, the time frame for the amount of time given for responses to be returned, whether or not we're going to endorse electronic submissions and so on. I personally don't support that for the reasons that we have heard given today. But again, as I said earlier, I think this part of the recommendation is too restrictive. I would ask council to consider a motion that simply asks staff to come back with a policy covering off on part A and then touching on the other areas of concern that have been identified so that at that time council can debate them and give their feedback. I think it's a waste of our time this evening to start debating each of these individual components. Let's get a staff report with recommendations, and then we can look at those and have a discussion at that time. So again, I'm not making a motion, and I'm a little torn on how I would vote if this motion as it stands was put on the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Thorpe. I'm going to go through the first-time speakers just for the discussion and then circle back around. So, Councillor Manley. Yeah, hold on, I'm just going to not do anything. There we go. You're on.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I agree with a lot of what's been said at the table here by Councillor Brown and Mayor Krogh and Councillor Thorpe. One of the things that I found, I went to the open houses at the Public Works Yard. And when people went through that process and listened to staff and understood what we were talking about, some of those folks said, I signed one of those forms and I wish I hadn't. You know, how do I get my form back? You can't get your form back. It's already been submitted by somebody else. And so the process of having people out collecting signatures, I've heard from a number of people who are in attendance tonight about their worries about the democratic process and about, you know, who has access to their information and about, you know, scrutineering, et cetera. I don't think that this is the kind of process that we should have people out with 100 forms or 1,000 forms going through that kind of process, especially when there's a lot of misinformation about what the project was about and what the options were in terms of how that, you know, how we would fund a project otherwise. So, yeah, I would agree with Councillor Thorpe. I'm looking for something that's less prescriptive, I think, in this motion, and would appreciate you know, staff coming back with a policy to consider. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Councillor Manley. Councillor Eastmere.
Thank you. So I think an amended recommendation could be that, so it starts off the way it is, that the GPC committee recommends staff return to council with a policy for the consideration that includes A, the method of communication, the number of forms per day, per person that people would be limited to pick up, and the inclusion of potential mail-out options for response forms and electronic submissions, so that we're not providing direction to staff, we're asking for them to come back with recommendations for our consideration. Does that make sense?
I will second that, Chair, wish to speak to it.
Okay, so I guess we have a motion on the floor now. Councillor Eastmere, would you like to speak to that again?
I think council's provided good comments, and yeah, instead of jumping ahead to providing specific direction, have a chance for staff to bring us back some options, and we can have a more fulsome discussion.
Thank you. Go to Councillor Brown.
Thanks, Chair. I won't be supporting as is for two reasons. First and foremost, the recommendation as written is to come directly back to council, and I think that's premature, especially based on this this recommendation. I think it should come back to the GPC because it's at this point I would say it's fairly ambiguous. And the second thing is I think there's a couple areas where staff are asking for clear direction at this stage, and to not do so is just I think doing a disservice to them going away and crafting some considerations for council, and also isn't alive to the fact of some of that pressure that was placed on staff previously because of those issues. So I think, in my opinion, the appropriate and responsible thing would be for council or the GPC to provide that clarity for staff so they can focus their efforts on those considerations and not be concerned or maybe burdened by some of the items that they simply need council direction from. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Perino.
Just waiting. Thank you, Chair. I agree with Councillor Brown, and I won't be voting in favor of this either. And I think the most important piece that we've talked about tonight is communication. So I'm very pleased with the fact that we realize that that's the piece that's That's the key, right? To inform the public as much as we can. And certainly, as Councillor Armstrong suggested, going out with bills, invoices, any of the newsletters that we do just to inform people that an AAP is coming and for them to know where to look for the information would be much more appreciated. The problem that I have is I agree with Councillor Brown that without giving staff direction, I am not in favor of 100 forms per day per person. I'm much more in favor of, I know, but I want to put something more firm down for staff to be able to take away, and I agree with bringing it back to the GPC meeting.
Thank you, Councillor Prino. Councillor Mayor Crowe.
Thank you very much, Chair. The reason I supported Councillor Eastmere's motion was because I took from her, I thought, rather clever wording that staff was free to recommend what I think most of us have indicated already, that with respect to mail-out options and electronic submission, that was a non-starter. Because just to be clear, it is a non-starter for me. I'm concerned about privacy, about abuse. Candidly, one thing I didn't mention, which seems to be a common item in the news, is porch piracy. So I whip around and steal your forms, you don't know, I flop a signature on it. Who knows if you're getting an honest representation of voters? Now, I realize that's a bit extreme, but having said that, if you take voting seriously, and I do, then that's an important consideration. I'm perfectly happy to have someone move an amendment to the motion that's more specific, but with respect to the forms, I thought Councillor Eastmere made it clear that that would be a staff recommendation. And again, I don't think anyone is suggesting a significant number of forms. Certainly, I wouldn't be supportive of that, but I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks. Just to interject here, I do think that there is a need to give, staff have asked for some direct feedback on mail-out options, specifically the electronic submission forms. And if there is direct feedback on the number of forms, I think that should be clear, and we can entertain voter recommendation on that, and this probably should go back to the GPC. I recognize that there is a motion on the floor, and so potentially we should just vote clear that, and then put some different motions on the floor. Is anybody else like to speak to this motion before I call the question on it? Councillor Armstrong. Yep.
Through the chair, if you just want to give us a moment, we'll try to get the motion up on the screen here.
I'll speak to it. If you want to, okay. I am in agreement with this because I think staff has heard enough about what we've said, what we want. I think she's heard very clearly that we think 100 is way too many. I think I've heard the terms 25 and 20, so I think staff has been given direction on that. Nobody else, I think she's heard, nobody disagreed with me that we don't want to see mail-in ballots or electronic signatures. So I think there's been enough discussion that Ms. Scurry has enough to bring it back to us, and then we can discuss it at that time. And I'll look to her to see if she's received enough information that she feels she can reflect what she's heard from this table.
Thank you, Chair, through you to Councillor Armstrong. I have heard from the majority of you where you are at. However, I do understand what Councillor Brown is saying too, because we did ask for direction on the inclusion of mail-out options for response forms and electronic submissions. However, because we have heard that, if we were to return instead to a GPC instead of council, perhaps that could be an amendment. We could ensure the GPC has a good feeling about that policy prior to making a recommendation to council.
Thank you. Go to Councillor Brown and Councillor Thorpe.
Thanks. The issue for me here is that as written is very ambiguous. And so when a motion doesn't properly capture conversation, then someone's going to say, well, I said this, why isn't that captured? And someone else says, I said this, and why isn't this captured? And so like that first, the method of communication, based on what? Like the taxation hit, the scope of the scale of the project, the type of project, I think that's problematic. I think very clearly in the report is a request to provide direction on the number of forms. I don't understand why we're postponing that when direction is there and there's like consensus there. Yeah, so I can't see the motion in front of me, but I would like to propose some amendments.
If we could get the motion up.
We're
so
working
they're
on it.
working
Thank you, Chair. Just if you could just have just 1 minute patience, we're getting it up there. I believe this captures it.
Yeah, so first of all, I think I would move that it be amended, that it be brought back to the Governance Priorities Committee. I would,
Could we just do one amendment at a time?
well, I'm trying to capture it all in one because we don't want to get,
Okay. You want to do it all in one? Okay, yeah.
and that the number of forms be set at 10 per person. No, not per day, per person, for the entire duration. Even 300 forms is ridiculous.
So is that an amendment that you're proposing, Councillor Brown?
So yeah, is that it, Councillor Brown?
I think I would leave, I understand, I actually think there's divergence on C at this table. And
Absolutely.
that should be debated properly as it comes forward.
Okay, so the amendment is to send it back to the GPC as opposed to council, and to change the number of forms that can be picked up to just 10 per person for the duration of the period. Okay, seconded by Councillor Perino. Any debate on the amendment on the floor?
Over here.
Okay, Councillor Eastman.
I think this is a good, friendly amendment. I actually did anticipate that it would come back to GPC, so I appreciate the clarification on that, because we're definitely not ready to have it at council. The reason I had included the options for the number of forms was because I didn't feel like there was an actual agreement around the table around how many forms. Councillor Brown said 20, Mayor Krogh said 10 to 15, so if it's, yeah, I don't have a strong feeling one way or the other how many forms a person's allowed to pick up per day, but I would support 10 because photocopiers exist, and yeah, so I'm in support of this.
Okay, Councillor Hemmons.
Thank you, Chair. I agree, friendly amendment, clear for staff. I do have a question, though, the 10 forms that can be picked up per person. If it's for the duration of the AAP, what would that look like for staff to check in and say, who did you pick up forms yesterday? What, you know, I think it could get a bit complicated. So I'm going to vote in support, but I do want to acknowledge when that comes forward, that would probably require some consideration of enforcement by front-end staff at City Hall, which is kind of what we want to avoid based on our previous experience.
Thank you. Councillor Thorpe.
Thanks, Chair. So we're getting more and more convoluted here, and it's harder for me to follow what exactly we're voting on. I'm fine with it coming back to a GPC. I believe that we have given staff some direction, and I don't agree that there is agreement among council on a number of these points, including the number of forms. So my vision is that staff, having heard our discussion tonight as a starting point, comes back to us with a draft policy which speaks to each of these items, attempting to convey what they think they heard staff say and make a recommendation. And then at that point, we can go through that policy point by point, and if we don't agree with the recommendation, we can debate it as an individual point and change it at that time. So I don't think we should get too far into the weeds tonight. So I guess I'm going to support the amendment and Councillor Eastmuir's motion. I think that's reasonable. But I think when it comes to actually fine-tuning the direction, that's our next step. And it's very common that we rely on staff coming to us first with their advice and expert opinion, hopefully based on what they've heard from Ms. Sworn as well. And then at that point, if we don't like it, we can debate it and change it. So that's where I'm at, and I think that puts me in favor of the amendment and the motion, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Thorpe. I'm in support of the motion. I think that, you know, staff are looking for a bit of direction. We've talked on a few points around the forms. I do think it needs to go back to the Governance and Priorities Committee because there's going to be a definite set of items that are going to require more debate, probably the forms, and I think also the electronic submission response and the mail out. And for myself, I think what's really important for me with the whole AAP process is that we are continually building a more informed and accessible local government. And I think that's something that we can continually improve. And the things that I appreciate about the electronic submission, because I'm going to provide my perspective on it, is that, you know, from the different options that are there, there is an opportunity to be able to have people load up the picture of their form that's signed. They go to the city website, take a photo of it, and it counts. And it sounds like that methodology is free from the trappings of having you know, exposure to cyber attacks and all the different issues, and it's feasible. And I do think we have to endeavor how to make the ability to participate in the democratic process accessible. And if it saves somebody having to drive across town to drop off a form, or have somebody printing off 10 and coming to them to bring it back, it makes sense. We're going to need to move, I think, as a society in that direction anyhow. We might as well start getting on it. The second thing is that I do think that an informed population is extremely important, and we do need to get better at how do we get the message out to people. And I'm always astounded that I've never heard about this borrowing, or how did I hear about it? And I'm just like, you know, how do you get around this? And we do live in an era where there's different demographics of people getting their information in different areas. Some people read the newspaper, a certain generation. Some people are online. Some people are on social media, and it's tough to get the information out to everybody so that they have. But I do think people do need to be informed of the process and do need to be informed about the content. So the process is, how does the AAP work? How does the whole borrowing thing? And then also the content is whatever that issue is of that day. I do like the idea of an information mail out, not a notification, but one that gives, hey, heads up, we're going into a borrowing process. You should be aware that there's this thing called an AAP. This is how it works when we have to borrow. And this is where the information is, and have the website where they go to the city information. There's maybe, you know, these documents for you to read through, and to just lay it all out so people can't say, at least we could know that there is, you know, if there's 40,000 or how many addresses are, there's that many placards that have been sent out, you know, a month before, in addition to what we're doing on social media, in addition to what's in the papers. And at least we've had the broadest breadth and people are aware, because the majority of the complaints is, I wasn't aware about this thing, I don't know anything about the process, and then in that information void, you have people saying whatever, and everybody's confused and frustrated, and then you get weirdness happening. And we do really need to limit the weirdness, and I think it's something that we do need to address and be very direct as a city about, is the incivility that's been happening, and not stand for it. And I think that we can do our part by making sure people are informed, but at the same time, yeah, draw the line. And so I'm in support of this, and we'll call the question. All in favor? Motion carried.
Chair, so you voted on the amendment. I think the amendment was actually seconded. So now could you vote on the main motion as amended?
Absolutely, I was just about to get to that. Now, the vote for the motion as amended. All in favor? Opposed? Motion carried. And that, yep, Councillor Brown.
Chair, if acceptable by you and council, just due to the time constraint, I would like to move that staff prepare a resolution for submission to the Union of British Columbia Municipalities Annual Convention outlining issues around the clarity and process of the legislation that governs the alternative approval process.
Anyone speaking to it? Councillor Eastmer, do you want to say anything? Okay. All in favor? Opposed? Motion carried. Councillor Eastmer.
Thank you. I would like to move another motion that the city requests that the province send a letter to the province requesting amendments to the applicable legislation pertaining to the AAP to remove the issues that have arisen. I can elaborate that on, if it's seconded.
Seconded by Councillor Hemmons.
Okay, and this is speaking to recommendation 21 in the report. Because it says it would be worthwhile for the city to request amendments to the community charter to clarify how sections 94.2 interacts with section 86 in terms of publication of the first and second notice, the timing as to whether a local government can receive a completed electoral response form before the second publication, and whether an electoral response form is still valid if the local government receives an emailed or faxed form within the deadline, but receives the original after the deadline. So these are questions that were directly brought up in the report, and I think it does warrant sending a letter to the province about it, regardless of whether or not the UBCM motion, how that goes.
Okay, so motion, just to summarize on the floor, is from the recommendations that's in a report, sending a letter to
the province to flag the issues and to request that they clarify the legislation.
Okay. Any questions or comments on that? Okay, call the question. All in favor? Opposed? Motion carried. Okay. Anything else, council? Seeing none, that brings us to question period. Mr. Jeff Ainsley.
Hello, Mayor and Council. Before I go to my comment and my question, point of clarification for the gallery and people watching online, because it was mentioned several times, I just want to make sure that people understand that canvassing is okay and that collecting of forms is okay as long as consent is given, right? You can return multiple forms to. We're not talking about forms you pick where you can return multiple forms. I'm pretty sure the legislation clearly states that.
I appreciate the public notification, but it's question period, so if you could just ask your question.
Well, that's the first question, just that as long as you have consent, you can do that. That's
Thank you.
Right? Is that correct?
Yep.
Okay. Second, I just want to make a quick comment about the AAP 1 because I did fully read the document that Mrs. Swarn submitted. I want to say that you guys made the right decision by canceling an AAP, and it's not because I realize what you're seeing, what the CRD is doing. You maybe wish you'd done that. But 2 days before the AAP was finished on November 3rd, I observed on your website that the return date was actually put at November 23rd, 2023. And that was, I've screen captured and documented that as well. And that was edited at one point after the November 3rd date. So I don't think there's a judge around that would have held that AAP. So you did make the right decision by canceling the first one. So my question, and to three of you on the council is not really fair because you weren't elected at this point, but I attended a council meeting in spring 2022 where this subject was discussed. And I'm just wondering why it was never brought to referendum during the 2022 election. If that was discussed, why it was turned down, or if you chose not to, could you just elaborate on that, on those discussions that happened in terms of that?
Thank you. The discussion of the Nanaimo Operations Center has been ongoing, and it just wasn't at a place to be able to bring it. From my recollection, the project wasn't as a place to bring forward for public approval for borrowing at that place. It still needed some work to get to that point. I don't know if anybody else wants to comment. Councillor Brown?
Yeah, I could look for confirmation, exact confirmation for staff, but I understand the value engineering process wasn't complete at that point either. There was some additional work
Was the referendum discussed, though? Just because you did have the time frame. This was, I believe, late May, early June. So you would have had the time frame. Was it discussed at any point? Because, again, that would have been free. It wouldn't cost us anything to.
Yes,
simply put it.
I think at least for 3 years. So it was in different iterations as the project was developing.
Okay. But it wasn't specifically discussed to put it on the election then. Is that correct?
Through the chair, can I just try to answer the question? I think, in fairness, the discussion about the Public Works yard and improvements needed there have been going back decades, not just back to 2022. It's been going on for a very long time. And I don't recall the exact discussion in the spring of 2022, but I'm sure it was brought forward at a time when we were identifying to council a number of capital projects that were unfunded at the time and needed to be addressed by that council or future councils. I think the short answer is we did not put the question to council about do you want to go to AAP or referendum at that time, because we simply were not advanced enough in the project planning to have those numbers.
Okay, thank you.
Could you call Mr. Frank Pluta?
Thank you very much. A lot of mention has been made over the AAP process and the cost of doing a referendum versus the AAP. So my question is, what was the cost of the first AAP, the second AAP, the legal cost for each lawyer involved in that, and then the review that was done by Lisa? Can we have an idea how much that is?
Thank you for the question. I'm going to have to look for staff if there's been a tally.
Thank you, Chair, through you. No, we have not tallied those costs. I had looked at the cost of the first AAP after it happened and looking into the second one, and my ballpark numbers were around 7,000 for the first one. That does not include legal costs that were looked into afterwards. The second AAP, there was significantly more advertising done, and I think it was around possibly closer to 10,000. But again, legal costs were not in that. Ms. Warren, I'm not sure if Mr. Lindsay has a ballpark figure, but I believe it was under $10,000. So between 5,000 and 10,000, I'm not sure of the exact number.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that, and I hope everyone takes that into consideration. That each step is a costly process, especially when it's reviewed and requires legal representation to form an opinion. The question is a bit redundant, but why did you choose to basically do the minimum of advertising that's outlined in the AAP Act itself?
The question is, why
was it
did we do the minimum advertising?
Correct. And like putting in the newspaper once?
Yeah, I understand that there's, it's a pretty standard rollout that we've done in the past of the AAPs in terms of public notification, and I'm not sure if there's a minimum set. I know there's minimum legislated around notification for the AAP, but in terms of communications and advertising, there's my understanding that there isn't any sort of standard set. Do I have to confirm that with staff?
The chair, what I would say is I would not concur with the statement that the city did the minimum when it came to notification. I think that, especially with the second AAP, there was extensive efforts put into providing all types of materials for anybody who was interested in the project, and plenty of notice, including multiple presentations at GPC meetings leading up to that time.
And just outside of that, though, too, there is no legislative, there's no standard or set around that communication anyhow.
There's the standard around when the official notice has to be given. But above and beyond the official notice, there was all types of information that was shared with the community on the actual project.
So a bit further to that, do you realize what year that act was put into place?
Sorry, I didn't.
The AAP Act? 1962.
Oh.
At that time, communication channels were totally different. We had smaller communities, closer communities, covered doubly over with newspapers that most people read at that time. Victoria Regional District did a.
Mr. Pluta, I hate to cut you off,
Okay.
and I
So-
appreciate your time, but it is question period, so if you do have a
Okay.
question, that would be
So,
greatly appreciated.
what I would like to point out is that technology today has moved forward by more than 50 years. And we have the ability to utilize technology to our advantage. So when we're doing electronic voting plus, let's say, ballot form voting, we have the ability, and we must be doing the ability of checking off on the voters list to see.
Mr. Pluta, is there a question snuck in there anywhere?
Why is electronic voting not being allowed if we have to check it against the voter list?
Okay, I appreciate that, and I think that is something that is being discussed about the electronic possibilities and at the next GPC, so that we'll be having that discussion. Councillor Brown?
Yeah, just quick clarity, just because I don't like it when inaccurate information gets spoken as truth. The community charter outlines the alternative approval process, and that was brought in early 2000.
That was with the original act itself, which is still being followed.
The community charter was developed and brought in and enacted as a brand new piece of legislation, and I think it's Division 4 of the community charter outlines the alternative approval process. So, so it was reconsidered as part of a modernized act that is considered by most in municipal law as the most modern piece of legislation that governs municipalities in Canada.
And thank you, Mr. Brown, Councillor Brown. Councillor Armstrong, did you have something that you
I
wanted?
was just going to say, for me, I'm totally opposed to electronic voting because there's too much frauds involved. There's lots of investigations into them. There's lots of issues with it. We're not there yet. So for me, I'll be frank with you, and you heard that right from Ms. Swarm herself, that there's too many issues right now with electronic voting.
It's true with paper too. You were talking about how.
Mr. Pluta,
That's just my take.
in terms of debating, it just is not the appropriate moment in time for that. Do you have any other questions, or is that?
That'll be fine. Thanks for your
Great.
attention.
Thank you for your time. Jean-Guy Leclerc.
Good evening. I agree with Mr. Bartlett that we should have more time, because once you tell the public about your AAP, that's a shock to them. You've been talking about it together for a long time, but now you just all of a sudden give it to the people out there to make a decision. Now, you make a decision right away. Like, give people time. So I agree that it should be 60 to 90 days. Why not? That's my question.
Thank you for the question. How come not 60 to 90 days?
Exactly.
For me, just thinking about the whole process, a referendum, you just call and people really have one day to make their vote. There's a bit of a heads up beforehand, where the AAP does stretch out the duration where you can hand in your decision. And I think in 30 days provides, a significant amount of time to get the information out and for people to decide. I think prolonging it is, 93 months on something like this when it just doesn't really sit right to me. I think that you'd be fully capable of making the decision in 30 days if the proper notification and information was sent out, and I think that's something that the city is going to be focusing and working on, and 30 days then once that's been met should be plenty. But I don't know if other council members have any comment on that. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
I'm not seeing any other questions. Councillor Krog, or Mayor Krog, Councillor Eastmere.